Hello everybody, and welcome to the second installment of our JOURNcomm Shoptalk series. We're lucky enough today to have Mr. Ed Bremer from KSER Radio join us to talk about his career in radio. Ed has been a radio producer for more than 30 years and has worked for radio organizations of all sizes, from pieces for BBC and NPR to our own KSER Radio here in Everett. Ed is currently the News and Public Affairs Director at KSER and is the host of the weekly show Sound Living. Thank you for joining us, Ed.
I'm glad to be here.
I think the first question I have is my students often come into class and they've seen enough reporters on television shows and movies that they know what a reporter is, or at least have a vision of what a reporter is. You're a radio producer. I was hoping maybe you could tell us what exactly is that?
Well, it varies. In every case, it varies from station to station. So what your job as a producer is going to be what your boss tells you your job as a producer is. For myself, the producer of a radio piece is the editor, the assignment editor, the sound mixer, the field recordist, the writer, the technician, the questioner, the host. So in my job, in my stations, in my career, I, as the producer, have basically done everything necessary from the inception of the idea to the piece actually getting on the radio.
Good. How did you get started in radio?
My first experience in radio was in college when I got involved with the radio station at my college. At that time it was a carrier current, and I don't know if anybody knows what carrier current is, but it was a radio station that just went by wire to the buildings on the campus, the dorms and things of that nature. So it was a very, very low-key kind of operation. But that was my first experience in radio, and it just bit me. And I've been with it since then, and that would have been 1970.
And did you know right away radio was going to be your thing?
I did. It was all inside work and no heavy lifting. So I did know. I really, really enjoyed what I was doing. For me, it was fun to sit by myself inside a little room and talk to myself and have that kind of fun being on the radio, being a different person on the radio, and no one being able to see me or do anything or talk to me about what I was doing. So I enjoyed it from the very beginning.
Good. You've worked for a range of sizes, and on one end of the spectrum, BBC and NPR are some of the biggest radio organizations in the world. Now you're working at community radio. Kind of there. In my professional career, I've worked at mostly community newspapers. So give me a sense of kind of the difference between what it's like to work for those different size organizations.
Well, my work with the BBC was very, very minimal. I did some voice work for them. They would call and say they need a 30-second voicer on this. Can I go out to this event and get some audio? And then I would just send them the audio and they would use it. So it's not. But I did do and produce reports for NPR, National Public Radio in Washington, D.C. And the biggest difference is that I didn't have control over the final product. I would get on the phone with an editor and we would go through every word that I wrote in the script. We would go through every actuality from the interviews that I did. They would package it and present it in a format and a structure that fit within the parameters of NPR. So I didn't really have that final control over the product. And I think that's the biggest difference between working for an organization like NPR and working for the community radio station is that control. And you just have to be willing to cede that control.
Right. And what were the benefits then of being at NPR?
National exposure. I had heard from people in different parts of the country by mail from some of the reports that I did. So there was a prestige that came with being on National Public Radio that you just didn't get working at KPBX in Spokane.
Good. So the students in this class have learned some basics of journalism, and we try to make our curriculum here as broad-based as possible. So if you want to go into broadcast, or if you want to go into print, or if you want to go into social media storytelling, you've got the basics of storytelling. But radio and audio storytelling have some specific things that you need to know. What would be some tips for audio storytelling or radio storytelling?
The number one tip would be good sound, because if you don't have good sound, they might as well read it in the newspaper, because they're listening and all they have is the sound that you have. So you need to make sure that the recording that you make of the guest is as high a quality as possible, that the background noise is as restricted as possible. You need to listen to the environment that you're in and perceive what sounds are going on, what events are happening that you can record that will enhance the story that you're trying to tell with the sound that you have available to you. A couple of examples. When I was assigned by National Public Radio to cover the first International Disabled Olympics, in addition to going out and recording the athletes, I would look around and I would see, what can I record to tell my story? So I hung my microphone over the targets for the archery and had them shoot arrows into the target so that I could get that sound. I held my microphone up and I recorded the twang of the bow. For the shot putters, they would chain the wheelchair to the ground so they could do the shot putting. So I recorded the sound of the chain being wrapped around the wheelchair and being locked down. So you listen to, you find the sounds that are going on, and you record them, and then you use that to sweeten the story. You use that to further the story that you're trying to tell, because all you have is sound. You don't have the luxury of picture. You just have sound.
It also seems that interviewing is extremely important in radio journalism, in all journalism. Kind of the quality of your interview and the quality of your source material will help shape the story. But in my experience in print journalism, I'm able to edit down, take specific phrases. I'm not having to put that person's voice on the air. So talk a little bit about radio interviewing and perhaps some tips for getting good radio interviews.
Well, I do this when you're putting together a what's called an acts and tracks, where you have actualities and you intersperse your own voice track.
Could you define actuality? I'm not familiar with that term.
An actuality is the quote that you're going to use in the newspaper. You call it a quote, we call it an actuality. So acts and tracks, voice track, and actuality is the term that you use when you're putting together the narrative. And so I do the same thing. I find the quote that I'm going to use and I write into that quote. Same kind of a process. When you're doing the interviewing, it's the same kind of process for doing a newspaper article interview. You go in prepared, you have questions that you want to get answered, but those questions are guidelines, and you want to be able to be well enough informed about the subject matter and your guest to be able to deviate from those questions, to ask follow-up questions based on what the guest says. You want to ask questions that are going to lead to more than a yes-no answer. So you want to prepare your questions in such a manner and ask them in such a manner that your guest just doesn't say yes and then stop talking. And you need to be prepared. You need to know how your guest pronounces the name. You need to know how the name is spelled.
Right.
I need to know how the guest pronounces his name. Things of that nature. So you need to go into the interview prepared.
You've done a lot of stories over the years. Is there a favorite?
I have done a lot of stories over the years. So if I were just say, what are my favorites, I would say, what story immediately comes to mind? And there are two. One is when I took my tape recorder and I went to Tecate, Mexico, and I did a run with the bulls. So I was in the street between the fences with my tape recorder, running for my life in front of the bulls. Came back and did a report on that. And another one is that I think of is when I got to go fly in the Goodyear blimp. I took my microphone, my tape recorder, I went up in the Goodyear blimp, and I got to fly it. So those are the two that immediately spring to mind that I really enjoyed putting together.
I'm sure you've also dealt with some difficult stories over the years where you're having to put a microphone in somebody's face in a difficult situation. Is there a difficult story that comes to mind?
I've never really done a lot of tragedy reporting. I've been fortunate that I've never had to do that. Probably the most difficult interview that I've done was when I was working at the public radio station in Spokane. 25 miles away was the Aryan Nation camp compound in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and having to go and interview Richard Butler and the people involved with the Aryan Nation, the white supremacists, was probably the most difficult.
Yeah, I can only imagine on that. I was on your show last year, before we went on the air, we talked a little bit about the future of terrestrial radio in the digital age, and I was just kind of curious to get your thoughts on record and share with our viewers. Where do you think radio is going in the digital age?
I wish I knew, because I'd make a fortune. But I think it's evolved, it's changed. I can imagine digital era radio being a variation of music format radio, but it's, instead of being a disc jockey, you're a pod jockey, and you are introducing different podcasts from different web addresses to the audience and letting them know that more of this is available at this website or something like that.
Again, still being a curator.
Right, still being a gatekeeper, still playing the role of introducing the audience to new things, because they don't have the opportunity to listen to every record by every artist. So someone, the radio station, serves as the gatekeeper and introduces them to new material, and it might go that direction.
On the news side of things, do you think shows like Sound Living translate well to the podcast format?
Not really, and the reason being is that my show is an hour, and the attention span of the podcast listener isn't that long, 20 minutes, and then they want to move on to something else. So that format, that structure, no, doesn't fit well in the podcast. But the idea of finding people and interviewing them and doing it in 15, 20-minute sections, it certainly does translate. Podcasting, it's just radio being delivered by a different medium.
Right.
And it's just audio. And if you do good audio, you're going to have a good product.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Bremer, for sharing time with us today. Thank you very much.